Welcome to the video lecture series, Culture, Worldview, and Origins. We're Tim and Holly. This series now, we're on the origin of life. This is number 5, lecture series number 5. We're looking at it from a non-Western perspective, biblical parameter. What does that mean? Is that we're trying to keep hammering that when we come to Scripture, or we come to anything, we come with a standpoint, we come with a perspective. And we need to come with a perspective of the same perspective that the other person has or had. In other words, the writers and the recipients of the biblical parameter, to understand it correctly and of what it was intentionally meant to mean and how it was understood, we must come with those parameters, a non-Western parameter of thinking. There are different ways of looking at the origin of life, and the origin of life will depend on our standpoint of how we see things. And this is one standpoint that is different. It's a naturalistic standpoint, but it's by Paul Kurtz on the origin of life. It says, "It is Prometheus, soaring and unbound, and the optimistic potentialities implicit in this tale provide the humanistic model." What does that mean? Well, it's Prometheus soaring and unbound. What they mean is he's loose. There are no tethers. There is nothing that chains him down. There's nothing of an outside authority that he must submit to. That is the humanistic model. So in other words, they are unbound. They are embracing the full humanistic model and pushing God or any other authority outside of authority out of the way for the humanistic model. But then he says, is this too all vain illusion? For are we not all conquered in the end by death? Death brings a sobering thought, is that we can be really arrogant, we can be really proud, and we can live life, we can do it my way, but when we get down to the end, there's questions. Did I do it right? Do I have the right to live and to have lived the way I did? Or is there going to be a God? Is there going to be a judgment? So that's why he says, is this too all vain illusion? For are we not all conquered in the end by death? And will not all of our plans and projects from the standpoint of eternity disappear? What do you think? Paul Kurtz, a very renowned person in the area of atheism. And so in other words, he has invested his life in teaching, showing, convincing people that God does not exist. But yet, when he gets to a candid moment, is this all too vain illusion? For are we not all conquered in the end by death? Death is stronger than any of us. But for those of us that have submitted to the redemption, to the plan of God, we understand that there's a first death and a second death. So there's not just one death. First death we all suffer through, which is the separation of life from the physical body. The second death, though, is the separation of that person from God for eternity into suffering. And so that is what we're not talking about or believe in just one death. There are multiple. There's 2 deaths that are involved in our life. 2 deaths if we do not accept the life from Jesus Christ. Vanity, oh vanity, will the ideals of Prometheus unbound likewise sink into quicksand? And in the end, are we not all immersed in a quagmire of doubt and indecision? Are we not left with the eternal question, how live? And does not this raise the further query, why live? In the last analysis, is there no answer to this ultimate quest for meaning? And are we led to the pit of utter skepticism? Paul Kurtz again, asking some real questions. If we reject God, we reject the open system, we close the system down, we base it on human reason, then why live? What's the purpose? If there is no purpose, then why live? It's a hard system to live a content life within, or a life of value, a life that's worth living. This system is hard. Genesis 2:7, going back to a biblical parameter. I invite you to consider a different worldview. Genesis 2:7, then the Lord God formed man of dust from the ground. Okay? So man is formed from dust of the ground, but that is not the finished product. That is not the finished process. God hands-on formed man. Does that make man a living being just because God formed him and put him into perfect functioning form, or that could function? No. The biblical record says, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being. The biblical record says that life comes from God. Even if God were to form perfectly the body, that body does not have life until God breathes into it the breath of life. It's the same command that when God commanded the waters to teem with life, God commanded the earth to produce life. It's that same power. It's that same that God breathed into man the breath of life, and man became a living being. That would be my objection to any scientific model that proposes that life is a basis of chemical compounds or just good design. Life is not because of a good design or because of the proper chemical compounds. Life is a product directly of God, God himself. That is the teaching of Genesis 2, verse 7. Job 33:4, the Spirit of God has made me, and the breath of the Almighty gives me life. That is the biblical record. Where does life come from? What generates life? Does life come from non-life, from chemical? And the biblical record would say no. Where does life come from then? Life is not in the chemical compounds. The life is not in the DNA. Life is not in any of that. Life is from God. Life resides in those carriers, those physical carriers, but those physical carriers are not life in and of themselves. It's like the DNA. The DNA is not in the chemical compound. The chemical compounds transport and hold the DNA, the information, but that information is not chemical or produced chemically in and of itself. Psalm 104:29. You hide your face, and they are dismayed. You take away their spirit, they expire, and they return to their dust. So in other words, God hides his face, God takes away the spirit, and we're dust. We return to dust. Why? Because it's the spirit that gives life, the spirit that animates. Somehow the chemical composition of our bodies are only carriers. They are not producers. They do not produce life. They carry it. And that life, if it departs that carrier disintegrates. Biblical example. Acts chapter 5, summarizing verses 1 through 11. It's not completely all the verses, but it's contained in 1 through 11. And as he heard these words, Ananias fell down and breathed his last. And great fear came over all who heard it. The young men got up, covered him up, and after carrying him out, they buried him. What happened? Ananias came in, and He brought in his offering. He had sold his property. And he said, this is what I got for my property. And Peter said, that's not what you got. You're lying. You're holding back. When the property was still yours, the money was yours. When you sold it, the money was yours. You could have done anything you wanted with it. But you tried to lie, tried to give a show before others and say, look at me, I am bringing everything and giving it, when it wasn't everything. You held some back. Now, he could have still held some back and given it and say, this is a portion of it, and that'd be fine. But instead, he lied. He lied not only to the people around him, but he lied to the Spirit of God that was present there. And what happened? And as he heard these words, Ananias fell down and breathed his last. Breathed his last. What happened? His breath was taken. He fell down and died. He was buried. Several hours later, his wife comes in. And Peter said to her, why is it you have agreed together to put the Spirit of the Lord to the test? Behold, the feet of those who have buried your husband are at the door, and they will carry you out as well. And immediately she fell at his feet and breathed her last. And the young men came in and found her dead, and they carried her out and buried her beside her husband. Okay, reading that through your worldview, one, is that possible? Okay, or is it impossible? This is what it said. This was written by a non-Western culture, which is an open system, which that is possible. Now, you might read it, and you are coming from a closed system, and you would say, that's not possible. Well, you see, that's the worldview. Look at it from another point. Look at it from another view. Where does life come from? Is it spontaneously generated by the chemicals? That's not, that's an assumption, and not even a real good one. So where does life come from? Well, the biblical record is clear that life comes from God, which is a pretty good assumption. And now this says God took it back. They lied, and God took it back. Psalm 104, 29b, it says, you take away their spirit, they expire and return to their dust. God has permission, not only permission, God is the owner. God is the authority. He has given us life, and He can take that life at any time. But through His grace and His mercy, He's allowed us to continue. And hopefully we understand, and we can understand something. And we can, before we lose that life or before that life runs out, we can make a choice to give honor and obedience to the owner of that life. Luke 23:46. And Jesus, crying out with a loud voice, said, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. Having said this, he breathed his last. Who killed Jesus? Nobody. Yes, he was crucified. But did the crucifixion kill him? No. No. It says here, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And having said this, he breathed his last. He died. So in other words, Jesus Christ voluntarily gave up his spirit. And he died. His spirit, he had accomplished his task. He had finished his race. He says, Father, into your hands I commit thy spirit. And his spirit left, and his body then died. So who is the author of life? Who is the owner of life? The author of life is the owner of life. Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man cometh unto the Father but by me. Where did life come from? And that is an important question, because all of us have life. At this moment, we have life. Where did it come from? If it's a chemical product then we're free to do and spend it however we want. But if that life is a gift, then we will be accountable of what we did with that gift. And that's the importance of this video series, is to just understanding the worldview and how it influences how we see things. And we might not be seeing things correctly. We have to assume a correct view of the world to understand correctly the world. So anyway, that's our challenge, is to try to see it through different perspectives and understand. And if you're interested in the biblical perspective, then try to see it through the non-Western standpoint. Thank you again for joining me. This is part 5. We have one more to go. Hope to see you in that one.